Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecture introducing Davidsonian events. Events are an addition to our ontology that will help us understand how verbs and verbal predicates work, and they will greatly increase our ability to understand empirically how the meanings of natural language expressions work and how they combine. So the notion of Davidsonian events comes from the work of Donald Davidson, a philosopher who in the late 60s wrote a very influential paper about what he called action sentences. And in it, he talks about adverbs. We haven't talked about adverbs at all in this course, and the reason is because, well, they're kind of difficult. So, to take a simple example based on one of his classic ones, if you look at number 1 in the handout, Jen made a sandwich slowly with a knife at midnight. Now that is a pretty straightforward sentence, but we can figure out what his truth conditions are. Right? It's true if Jen made a sandwich, if the sandwich making happened at midnight, and if it was slow, and if it took place with a knife. Okay, but how does that get represented formally? And another question, how does that get built formally? So if we think about adverbials, we can see right off the bat that they're very much like modifiers, right? We can add them as much as we like. We can move them around as much as we like. And they give us the same kinds of entailments that restrictive modification gives us with adjectives. So if you look at the various entailments of one, you can see some of them in two, right? That Jen made a sandwich, that Jen made a sandwich with a knife. One will entail that Jen made a sandwich at midnight, and so forth. A lot of different combinations of entailments that come out. Now, what we want to ask then is, if these adverbials are modifying something, what are they modifying? And Davidson suggests that they're modifying what he calls an action. That is, the actual event, the happening of the sandwich making. In this case, the sandwich making. So sentence one would be true when there's an action of Jen making a sandwich, and that action is slow, and the action is at midnight, and the action takes place with a knife. So how can we tell? What are the arguments that he gives? Right? It's not just an intuitive sense. He gives a few arguments. Now, the first one is that it's not really an argument, but he notes by way of discussing certain things he doesn't want to talk about in this paper. That, for instance, with degree predicates, it depends on what you're comparing it to. So a slow, if it takes you 15 hours to swim across the English Channel, it might be a slow crossing of the channel, which is only 40 kilometers across, but it would be a fast swim. So is it slow or is it fast? Well, it depends on what you're comparing it to. Well, adjectives do that too. And he has some other examples like that. Other ways that these adverbs behave like adjectives. But to show that they are really, that we really need actions, right, he gives a few arguments. The first one is this argument for modification. The second one involves anaphora. We have pronouns and we can use them to refer to what seem like actions, right? So if you look at 3 or 4, in 3, you say, I crossed the channel in 15 hours, good grief, that was slow. What was slow? What is that? What is it referring to? It's the crossing. Or if I say, I saw my grandma crying and it broke my heart. What broke your heart? It was your grandma crying. This event, this happening, this action that you saw, right? And this gets to his third point, that we can directly perceive these actions. We call this the argument of direct perception. So essentially, we can say things like, I saw the boat explode. Right? What did you see? Right? You saw this explosion. Or I heard the gorilla pound on his cage. Right? You heard this thing. You didn't even see it, but the sound from this event came your way. So if we're not perceiving the gorilla so much, what are we perceiving, right? The pounding. So, okay, we have these actions, but how does that help us formally? Well, if you try to understand how adverbs combine, we run into a problem really quick. If our verbs denote a relationship between two individuals, let's say a maker and a makee, as in 7, then what is the adverb going to tell us? It can't tell us much about the one thing or the other. And so, right, how are we going to fix that? So let's say Jen made a sandwich with a knife. Well, you can say, well, Jen had a knife, so if with a knife modifies Jen, that will work, or at least the property that we'll plug Jen into. So we can imagine, right, if we have Jen made a sandwich with a knife, that with a knife could modify Jen or something like that. But it's easy to find adverbs that don't. It's easy to find adverbs that can't modify the subject. So if you say Jen played well, right, that could be true if Jen was sick. Jen wasn't well at all. What is Jen, right? What is, right? It's not clear what Jen is in this case, but she is playing well. The playing is well. The action is good, right? So we say well. So, okay, we can't modify that. Well, let's have our actions, right? But what do we do with these actions in our semantics? And Davidson figures that we existentially quantify over them. And he does this by resurrecting an old point that Hans Reichenbacher made many years ago, but he hadn't really pursued to its end. And so if you take a sentence like 8, Amundsen flew to the North Pole, then for Reichenbach that could be translated into formal logic as there is something that consists of the fact that Amundsen flew to the North Pole. And Davidson picks up on that and says, well, what is this thing that consists of the fact? What is it? And he says that's the action, right? So you don't even really need to say there is an X that consists of the fact. You can say there is an X that is the action of Amundsen flying to the North Pole. So now we get to a compositional question. If the existential quantifier is binding these action variables, well, how did they get in the semantics in the first place? Where are they introduced into our denotation? And this is where Davidson makes this formal contribution. Says, well, it comes with the verb. The verb introduces this event argument, which we don't see. Right? There's no morpheme for it, but it's there semantically. And it allows us to existentially quantify over it. It allows us to modify it. And so that will get us the right entailments. So we see in 9 that our first sentence would mean something like this. There is an action of making the sandwich, of Jen making the sandwich. And that action is at midnight, and that action is slow, and that action involved the knife. And so we'll see in other lecturelets how we build that in more detail. But this notion that verbs introduce an argument referring to the action involved is one that is pretty much standard now. There are deviations here and there, and over the exact nature of these arguments and so forth. But the idea that verbs differ substantially from nouns in that they introduce this argument is one that's not really in dispute anymore. This approach is called the Davidsonian approach, and these events are called Davidsonian events in honor of Dr. Davidson. But we often just call them events at this point. And in any case, we'll call them events. He called them actions, but we'll call them events. And we will press forward from there and see how we can include them in a more modern and more compositional semantics than the one he was using.